Last weekend, we saw a bunch of crazy finishes and a lot of tiebreakers out of both Europe and South America. But in comparison, this weekend seemed a lot more straightforward. But that doesn't mean there still isn't a lot to talk about. So let's go ahead and get into the recap. In Group A, we had Gen G, Dignitas, Koi, and Shopify Rebellion. Gen G was of course the only team in the tournament that already had their spot at the major locked in. But every other team in this group was still fighting to keep their chances alive. Dignitas came into this event at 5th place, and they were slightly ahead of all the other teams who were all fighting to get into the major. Meanwhile, Koi and Rebellion were both a lot farther back, but they weren't totally out of it yet. But after round 1, they both got a little bit closer to elimination because they both took 3-1 losses. Rebellion took their loss to Gen G, and Koi took their loss to Dignitas. And these two series were basically identical because Gen G and Dignitas both won Game 1 and 2 before they gave up Game 3 and then came back to win Game 4 to finish off the gentleman's sweep. Round 2 was more of the same for Gen G, because after Koi pulled out the Game 1 win in overtime, Gen G dominated the rest of the series by outscoring Koi 13-3 over the last 3 games of the series, and they took the win after 4 games. But Dignitas was having a little more trouble with Rebellion. All of the first 3 games went in overtime, but after those first 3 games, Dignitas managed to come out ahead 2-1. But then after that point, it was Rebellion who pulled away with the series, because they shut out Dignitas in Game 4 and Game 5 to win the series in 5 games. Shopify had gotten some good results in the fall split, but before now, they hadn't gotten a single win in the winter split. But this team does have some talent, especially with a guy like Two Piece on their team. So it has to feel good for them to round back into form at least a little bit and pull out a big win like this. And that good form continued into the next round when they went up against Koi, because they pulled out a 3-1 win after Koi once again won Game 1, then lost the next 3 games in the series. So this meant that Rebellion was ending their group stage with a 2-1 record, but for Koi, it meant that they were finishing 0-3 and they were officially knocked out in the group stage. It's unfortunate to see this team going winless again after they made a run into the top 8 in the Winter Cup, but I think most people knew that result wouldn't be too sustainable for this team. Then the other round 3 matchup had Gen G going up against Dignitas, with Gen G looking to lock up first place in the group. Dignitas took Game 1 by a score of 2-1, but then Gen G averaged 4 goals per game across games 2, 3, and 4, and Dignitas couldn't keep up with that offensive output. Gen G won the series 3-1, and for the second time all season, they made it through the first stage of an event without taking a single loss. And the first time they did it was actually in the last event, the Winter Cup. So all season Gen G really hadn't been a day 1 team, but it looks like that trend is officially behind them. But in Dignitas' case, they now finished 3rd place in this group, which meant that they would probably have a really tough matchup against whoever finished 2nd in Group C, and a win in that series would be crucial for their major chances. But when this group was all wrapped up, we had Gen G in 1st, Shopify Rebellion 2nd, Dignitas 3rd, and Koi last. In Group B, we had Faze, M80, Knights, and Optic. And after they had been knocked out in the group stage in the last 2 tournaments, Optic was coming into this group as the last seed, which is something that probably nobody would have expected out of this team heading into the season. And as the last seed in the group, that meant for their first game, they had to go up against the first seed of the group, which was Faze Clan. So after the tough results they've had recently, going up against one of the best teams in the world for their first series isn't an easy way to turn things around. But they still got off to a pretty good start because they won Game 1 in overtime and then went into Game 3 with the series tied at 1-1. And to pretty much everybody's surprise, in that Game 3, we saw an offensive explosion from Optic because they won that game 5-1 and went on to match point. And Optic showed that the Game 3 win wasn't just a fluke, because they finished off the huge upset in Game 4 by taking a 2-1 win and winning the series 3-1. After how they started the winter split, a lot of people were ready to give up on Optic. But after this win, they reminded everybody why expectations were so high for this team in the first place. Because they do have some talent, and if they're playing well, then they can get some really big wins, like we just saw here. The other round 1 matchup was M80 against Knights, and with how well M80 had played in the last 2 tournaments, they were in the thick of the major race. And they continued that good form here with a solid 3-0 victory over Knights. Round 2 saw Faze Clan bounce back against Knights, as they swept them out of the series winning 3-0, and the other match was M80 against Optic. Heading into this tournament, M80 would have been the favorites in this series, but after Optic got that big win over Faze, it looked like things might have been just a little bit more equal. But as it turned out, it wasn't equal at all, because in this series, Optic ran away with it and won the series in the sweep. With 2 wins back-to-back over 2 really good teams, Optic was looking better in this tournament than they had all season. And that good form continued in their last series of the group stage, because after dropping Game 1 against Knights, they went on to win the series in 4 games, 3-1. It would have been nicer to play like this earlier in the split, so they would have had a much easier chance of making it to the major, but better late than never, I guess. Not to mention that they weren't entirely out of the major yet. But in order for them to have a chance of making it to the major, they would have to win the entire tournament, which isn't very likely, but if you can beat Faze Clan in the way that they did, then anything's possible really. Also, it has to be said that AJ was an absolute monster during the group stage, because in these 3 series, he averaged 1.64 goals per game. That is an insanely high number, and nobody was even close to him during the group stage. AJ has always been a premier offensive talent in Rocket League, but even with that in mind, for him to reach this type of level with his scoring is pretty crazy. But to round out the group, we had Faze going against M80. With the big win that M80 got over Faze in the first round of the playoffs during the first regional, you couldn't totally count out M80 in the series, even if Faze was the heavy favorite. But Faze showed that they had no interest in getting upset again, and they went on to win this series in a dominant 3-0 sweep, outscoring M80 13-5 over the 3 games. So the final standings in this group was Optic first, Faze second, M80 third, and Knights last. Group C featured G2, Space Station, Furia, and Ghost Gaming. Heading into this event, G2 was in 4th place in points and had a solid gap between them and 5th, so their major spot was already pretty secure, although not quite guaranteed. But Space Station and Furia were both in the big group of teams who were looking to break into the top 5. So the fact that these 2 teams would play each other in round 1 of this group was a huge matchup. And we got a really close series out of it too, because this series went all the way to 5 games. But in that 5th game, after a really close series, Space Station pulled away with a decisive Game 5 victory, winning by a score of 3-0. So Space Station were the ones to get off to a good start, and Furia would have to work their way back. And in the other round 1 matchup for Group C, G2 faced off against Ghost. And to nobody's surprise, after Ghost took Game 1, G2 went on to win that series in 4 games. Then in round 2, Furia had the tough task of trying to bounce back from a loss in a series against G2. But they showed that they were up to the task in Game 1 by winning that first game 5-3. Then we saw the next 2 games both going to overtime tied at 2-2, with both G2 and Furia getting a win in one of those games. So heading into Game 4, Furia was up 2-1. And in Game 4, we saw Furia do what hardly any team is able to do, and they shut out G2 in that last game, winning the game 1-0 and winning the series in 4 games. So right after their loss to Space Station, they immediately put themselves in a good position in the group again. And the other matchup in this round was Space Station against Ghost, and again, to nobody's surprise, Space Station won that comfortably, getting a 3-0 sweep over Ghost. In the final round for this group, we had G2 against Space Station, where SSG had a chance to lock up a 3-0 record. But a G2 win would have meant that both teams would be tied at 2-1, and they would have to wait for the results of the Furia against Ghost series to find out their fates. G2 would normally be considered the favorite in the series, but with the loss that they had just taken to Furia, it seemed like there might have been an opportunity for SSG to break through and get the win for themselves. But instead, G2 didn't give them that opportunity at all, because they won this series in a decisive 3-0 sweep. So now these 2 teams had to wait for the other matchup to see where they would end up in the group. And after taking 2 pretty swift losses against SSG and G2, it was expected that Ghost would meet the same fate here too against Furia. But Ghost was putting up a really good fight at first, especially defensively, because heading into Game 3, the series was tied at 1-1, with both Game 1 and Game 2 ending with the score of 1-0. Then we saw Ghost score in the Game 3 overtime to go ahead in the series and go on to match point. But with the Furia winning Game 4, the series would ultimately be decided in Game 5. And this game was huge for Furia, because a loss here would have meant that both of these teams would be tied at 1-2. And in this scenario, Ghost would have the head-to-head victory over Furia, which meant that they would be knocked out. So to avoid elimination and keep their major chances alive, Furia had to win this last game. But going into the Game 5 overtime, we see Hoxer take the ball down the field by himself to pull off the solo play and score the overtime goal, to give Ghost the huge upset and to eliminate Furia from the tournament and from the major. This is really tough for Furia to take, because after taking Space Station all the way to Game 5, and even getting the win over G2, they honestly look like they're in pretty good form. But in this format, you need to show that form in all 3 games, if you want to have a solid chance of advancing. And in this series, against the Ghost team who was supposed to be outmatched, that clearly wasn't the case. And now Furia have to go back to the drawing board if they want to bounce back in the spring split. And for the rest of the group, this loss also meant that G2 and Space Station were the only 2 teams tied at 2-1. And since G2 had the head-to-head win, they also get the tiebreaker. So the final standings in this group was G2 first, Space Station second, Ghost third, and Furia last. Finally in Group D, we had Complexity, Version 1, NRG, and Team Axel. Complexity came into this tournament at 2nd place in points, and they were already looking really good for the major. But Version 1 and NRG had a lot of work to do. NRG started off at 4 points behind 5th place, and Version 1 was 7 points behind. So they both needed a pretty good run to have a chance at the major. And when these 2 teams faced off in their first series, they gave us a really tight match the entire way. NRG jumped out to a 2-1 lead, before Version 1 scored in a Game 4 overtime to bring us all the way to a Game 5. And Version 1 took control in that Game 5, winning by a score of 2-1, where NRG scored their only goal with 5 seconds left in the game, after already being down by 2. Version 1 has had a tough split so far, failing to make it to the top 8 of either one of the last 2 regionals. But getting a win here over NRG is a good way to start a turnaround for their team. And in the other round 1 matchup, Complexity continued looking like one of the best teams in the region as they got a 3-0 sweep over Team Axel. And round 2 was more of the same for Team Axel as they got swept again, this time by Version 1. But the other matchup in this round was Complexity against NRG. Complexity had to be thought of as the favorite heading into the series, but after 2 straight overtime wins, NRG quickly put themselves on match point, and they looked like they were ready to take a really big win for their team. But after fighting for those first 2 wins, NRG couldn't get another one for the rest of the series, because Complexity won the next 3 games, and they got the reverse sweep to beat NRG. And this has kind of been the case for NRG for a while now. Most of the time, they look like they're playing pretty well, but for whatever reason, they always get really close to pulling out a big win, and then they end up falling just short. And it doesn't really matter how good you look as a team if you're not able to close out the series when you have a chance, and can't pull out the big wins when they matter most. But if there's one good thing to say about NRG, it's that they're usually able to get solid victories over the teams that they're supposed to. And that was the case here too, when they got a 3-1 win over Axel for their final series of the group stage. And the other match had Complexity going against Version 1, where the winner of this match would be 3-0 and finish first place in the group. Every series in this game ended with a score of 2-1, but after dropping game 1, Complexity won the next 3 games to go on to win the series in 4, and lock up first place in the group. And with this victory, they also locked up their place at the major, being the second team to do so after Gen G did it in the last tournament. So the final standings here was Complexity first, Version 1 second, NRG third, and Team Axel last. So going into round 1 of the playoffs, we had these 4 matchups. And we'll start with Version 1 against M80, because after this series, we will see one of these teams officially knocked out of the race for the major. And with how these 2 teams have looked recently, I was expecting M80 to get the series win here. But instead it was V1 who got out to a quick start in the series, winning the first 2 games, including an overtime in Game 2. M80 tried to fight their way back into the series with a Game 3 win, but they shut the door on the comeback in Game 4, winning that game 2-1, and taking the series to advance to the quarterfinals for the first time in this split, while also eliminating M80 from major contention. By making it into the top 8 in the first 2 regionals, M80 surpassed pretty much everybody's expectations for this team. And I've been pretty high on Lineblades for a while now, so it's pretty cool to see him get some good team results after so long. And in all honesty, I think this team will be just as dangerous in the spring split, if not even more so. So I'm sure that nobody's looking forward to playing them. But V1 wasn't the only one celebrating this win, because with V1 beating M80, G2's spot at the major was officially locked in. The next quarterfinal saw Shopify Rebellion going up against Ghost. Rebellion have made it to a top 8 before this season, so making it to this position isn't too unfamiliar for them. But there is probably nobody who expected Ghost to make it out of the group stage. But now, they were just 3 game wins away from making it to the top 8, and they wouldn't get any closer than that, because Shopify dominated this series. They won the first game 5-1, the second game 4-0, and the third game 3-0. So there was never really a point where this series was competitive. And for the second time all season, Rebellion made it to the top 8. But next, we had the most important series out of this entire round, because we had Space Station going up against Dignitas. These 2 teams were probably the most favored out of anybody to grab North America's last spot at the major, but now one of them would be eliminated here. And this was a really defensive series, because 4 of the games here ended in a shutout. Dig took game 1 by a score of 1-0, then SSG took game 2 by a score of 1-0. Then these 2 teams traded game 3 and game 4 as well, with SSG winning game 3 3-0, and Dig taking game 4 1-0. So far in the first 4 games of the series, these 2 teams combined to score 6 goals. But then in game 5, we saw 6 goals scored in regulation, because that deciding game went into overtime with the score tied at 3-3 after Space Station scored 2 goals in the final minute to come back. But in that overtime, we see Drees get a huge 50 win against Daniel to maintain control of the play, and Evo demos LJ as he rotates back to net, leaving the goal wide open for Drees, which gives Dig the game-winning goal, and a huge victory to knock Space Station out of major contention. This split was a huge step down for SSG, because after making it to the top 4 in every event during the fall, they didn't make it to the top 4 a single time in the winter. And when you have a player as good as Daniel on your team, then you're pretty much always going to be expected to make it to the major. But this split, that didn't end up being the case. So now a lot of people will have their eyes on this team as we head into the spring. And for the last match of this round, we had Faze Clan going up against NRG. And I just mentioned how NRG kept getting close to pulling off a big win, but fell just short. But this wasn't one of those series, because NRG wasn't even close. Game 1 went to Faze in the 2-1 overtime, but then over the next 2 games, Faze outscored NRG 9-1. So they got the 3-0 sweep and officially knocked NRG out of the major picture. So after this loss, we have one more split to see if NRG can get back up to the level that a lot of people want them to be. But at this point, it's kinda hard to be optimistic about it. Now going into the quarterfinals, we had these 4 matchups. And the first one of the day was G2 against version 1. G2 had dominated this matchup all season, because in the 3 series that they had played, G2 had won all of them, and version 1 only got 1 game win. So they would need to reverse this trend and get the upset win over G2 if they were going to keep their major hopes alive. But it seemed like that wasn't going to happen at first, because after the first 2 games of the series went into overtime, G2 got both wins, and it seemed like it was going to be another rout. But then after a timeout, version 1 bounced back in games 3 and 4 and got 2 wins of their own to knot up the series at 2-2. So in the first 4 games of this series, version 1 already got more wins than they had gotten off of G2 all season. Then we saw 2 more 1-goal games in game 5 and game 6, with G2 and V1 each getting a win, and that brought us all the way to Champions Field. And with 5 seconds left in that final game, we see JNaps hit the ball off the sidewall to pass it infield to Atomic, and then he gets a double tap off of the ceiling to get the ball past beast mode and score the series winning goal for G2. After being at the center of the fiasco that was Rise's botched transfer to North America, version 1 had a pretty rough split in the winter. But making it back to the quarterfinals and playing G2 in a really tight series in the quarterfinals in the last event is a pretty decent way for this team to end their split, even if they were hoping for a lot more than decent. The next quarterfinal matchup was Optic against Rebellion. Both of these teams were playing well heading into the series, but by getting wins over teams like Faze and M80, Optic definitely looked like they were in better form. But this match was also important because both of these teams still had a chance at the major. Because if either one of these 2 teams won the whole event and then Dignitas lost their quarterfinal matchup, then they would take over North America's 5th seed and they would be going to the major. But even with the good form that Optic had shown so far, Rebellion took the lead first in the series, because they were up 2-1 heading into game 4, and their 2 wins were a lot more dominant than Optic's 1 win, because Rebellion won both game 1 and game 3 by a score of 4-1, while Optic only took game 2 by 1 goal after going into overtime. But if that showed anything, it was that if the games were going to be close, then Optic were going to be the ones to clutch out. Because game 4 and game 5 both went into overtime, and Optic got both of those wins again. So they're up 3-2 heading into game 6. And that ended up being the final game of the series too, because Optic got the win in one last tight matchup to advance to the semifinals and to knock out Rebellion. And before we move on, I have to talk about how well 2P's played in this tournament. Back in the day before they were eligible for RLCS, you would often see Daniel, Chronic, and 2P's all playing together in smaller tournaments. And even though Daniel got most of the hype out of these players at the time, it was still very obvious that all 3 of them were very talented. And since then, we've seen Daniel and Chronic have some team success at the top level. But 2P still hasn't seen the same success as his 2 former teammates yet. And while there might be a lot of reasons for that, individual talent is definitely not one of them. Because in this event, he showed that he is extremely good. He finished 5th in goals per game, 2nd in assists per game, and 1st in saves. So he was all over the field and he was dominant in pretty much every area. So yeah, 2P is the real deal, and I just wanted to make sure that he got some love. Next up, we had Complexity going against Dignitas, where a win for Dig would have locked their place into the Winter Major. But Complexity struck first in the series by winning game 1 and game 2. So Dignitas called a timeout before going into a must-win game 3. But after nearly 4 minutes of overtime in that game, we see a crazy play where AJG bumps Razebull, which puts him in the perfect position to stop Drees' clear. And from there, Razebull is able to center the ball to CRR, and he scores the overtime goal to give Complexity a huge lead in the series. And at that point, the series was pretty much a done deal, and Complexity finished it off in game 4 after a much shorter overtime that only lasted 9 seconds. So now Complexity was heading to the quarterfinals for the 3rd straight event, and Dig would have to wait for Optic to lose before their spot would be officially locked in at the major. And for the last quarterfinal, we had a pretty crazy matchup, because with Gen G facing off against Faze Clan this early in the tournament, that meant that one of the 2 best teams in North America wouldn't even make it to the top 4. And this series was one of the most impressive defensive performances I had seen in a long time, because after the 2 teams traded game 1 and game 2, Faze completely locked in on defense for the rest of the series. They shut out Gen G in game 3, 4, and 5, and they won all 3 of those games by a score of 1-0. Gen G has one of the best offenses in the entire world, so it takes a crazy performance to shut them out 3 games in a row. But that's exactly what Faze did. And Faze has always been known for having a crazy offense. And in fact, they still have a crazy offense this season because they lead the region in goals per game. But if they're able to pair that offense with defense like this, then I'm honestly not sure if anybody's going to be able to stop them. So now we get into Championship Sunday, and the first match of the day was G2 against Optic. Dignitas' loss to Complexity meant that Optic still had a chance at the major if they could win the entire tournament. But before they could think that far ahead, they had to get past G2. Optic was playing really well in this tournament, so it wasn't out of the question for them to get the win here. But in this series, G2 showed Optic that there are still levels to this. G2 took the first games by 1 goal apiece, winning 1-0 in Game 1 and winning 2-1 in Game 2. And after Optic called a timeout following that Game 2 loss, the timeout buff was nowhere to be found, because Game 3 was even worse, with G2 taking the win there 3-0. And while Optic did put up more of a fight offensively in the last game, they still couldn't keep up with their opponents, and G2 won that last game 5-3, getting the sweep in the series and knocking Optic out of the tournament, while also making it to the Grand Finals for the first time all season, which sounds pretty crazy for a team like G2. Plus, this loss for Optic also officially locked in Dignitas' place as the last team out of North America to go to the Winter Major. After having a really rough split for the entire winter, it was really good for Optic to show that they still have the ability to make it this far in tournaments. But at the same time, having one pop-off performance isn't enough to make people happy, because if you want to have real success, you need to be consistent across all tournaments, and that's something Optic has struggled with all season long. So we'll see if that's something this team is able to work on, if they stick together for the spring split. The second quarterfinal matchup was Faze Clan against Complexity. After a blowout in the other semifinal matchup, it seemed like this one was going to be closer, with two of the best teams in the region going up against each other. But while the individual games might have been more competitive, the result of the series ended up being the same. All 4 of the games were only decided by 1 goal, but Faze won all 4 of them and swept Complexity on their way to the Grand Finals. And this series that they would play against G2 would be the last chance for anybody to be competitive with Faze in the playoffs. Because after the loss that Faze took to Optic in round 1 of the group stage, Faze Clan went 17-1 in total games. So if anybody was going to stop their rampage, it had to be G2. But after a 5-3 win for Faze in Game 1, it looked like that wasn't going to happen. But then we saw G2 clutch up a little bit, because they got a 0-second goal in Game 2 to win the game after Atomic passed the ball off the back wall to JNaps, who was able to put the shot away. And then we saw them get another 0-second goal in Game 3 to send it into overtime after JNaps returns the favor by getting a flip reset pass over to Atomic, who knocked in the goal. But after 3.5 minutes of OT, Faze were the ones to score the overtime goal, and they took the game win to go up 2-1 in the series. And from that point on, they didn't look back. Faze got the wins in Game 4 and Game 5 to close out the series in 5 games and to claim their second straight regional title and their third of the season. And this also capped off one of the most impressive playoff runs we've seen in a while. Heading into this tournament, the top 4 teams in the region were G2, Complexity, Gen G, and Faze. So that meant that Faze had played every other team that set themselves apart during the winter split. And they also played NRG in the playoffs too. And in those 4 series, they won a total of 15 games and only lost 2. You can't get a much more difficult playoff run than that, and Faze made it look really, really easy. In my opinion, this is the best that Faze has ever looked since they joined RLCS. And with the next tournament being the Winter Major, there's not a better time for them to come into this form. And with how good they've looked in the past 2 events, they might be the favorite to take the whole thing in San Diego. Now, as we get into the other regions, let's get into the Middle East, because there's one storyline that everybody had their eyes on. After the results of the first 2 regionals, Rule 1 was 8 points behind Falcons for the major spot. And if both of those teams went on to win their group and meet up in the finals like they had in the last 2 events, then Rule 1 could at best make up that gap by 4 points, and they would miss out on the major regardless. But if Rule 1 finished second in their group, while Team Falcons won theirs, then they'd be able to meet up with them in the quarterfinals, and to win there would allow them to make up the gap by 12 points, if Rule 1 went on to win the tournament. And that would give Rule 1 enough points to overtake Falcons and take the major spot for themselves. And in the last match of the group stage, it seemed like the fix might have been in. Rule 1 took Game 1 by a score of 4-0, but then in Game 2, both Rawas and Clears lost their connection. And since they were disconnected for too long, they were forced to forfeit Game 2. So it looked like they were potentially trying to force their way into that quarterfinal match after all. But then after that forfeit in Game 2, both of the twins were able to reconnect, and Rule 1 got back to business as usual. They went on to win Game 3 and Game 4 of the series to win their group. And then of course, as expected, Team Falcons also won their group. So that meant that unless one of these teams got upset before then, they wouldn't face each other until the Grand Finals, at which point Falcons would have already locked up the major spot. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Because as most people expected, both Rule 1 and Team Falcons walked their way into the Grand Finals. And after Falcons got the 4-0 sweep over Cola in the semifinals, they were officially locked into the major. So now with these 2 teams facing off once again in the Grand Finals, the only thing that was on the line this time was a little bit of extra money, points, and pride. But in the first 2 games, Rule 1 showed that was all the motivation they needed, because they jumped out to a 2-0 lead in the series, winning the first game 5-1 and winning the second game 2-1 in overtime. Then after Falcons tried to fight their way back into the series with a win in Game 3, Rule 1 shut the door on the comeback by winning both Game 4 and Game 5 to get their first regional win of the winter split and their first RLCS win over Team Falcons since the very first tournament of the season, the Fall Open. So while this win might not be enough to get them into the major, it was still really important for this team to get a win over Falcons. Because after Falcons had dominated the matchup for so long, it was beginning to look like Rule 1 wouldn't be able to keep up with them at all. But now we can say for sure that that isn't the case, and now this team has a bit of extra momentum as they get ready for a push to the Spring Major. And now finally, as we go into Oceania, this region probably had the least interesting major scenarios. Pioneers came into this event at 2nd place in points, being 8 points behind Ground Zero and 8 points ahead of the Him Police. Every other team in the region was already eliminated from the major, and with 8 points separating the Him Police and Pioneers, they would have needed to have a huge tournament to make up that difference in points. But as we skip straight into the quarterfinals, we quickly saw that that huge tournament wasn't going to happen for them, because they lost in the quarterfinals to Serrani, and were officially knocked out of the event, which meant that both Ground Zero and Pioneers were both officially locked into the major. So that was pretty much the end of the major implications for this region. But there was still some really interesting stuff going on, as we saw in the next quarterfinal with Power going up against Dumb Luck Esports. Heading into this split, Power was by far the favorite to make it to the major out of this region. But after disappointing losses to Pioneers in the quarterfinals of each of the last 2 events, their major chances were already gone. But they still had a chance to make a statement by winning this tournament. But after going up 3 games to 1 in this series against Dumb Luck Esports, the quarterfinal curse hit Power again, because Game 5 and Game 6 both went into overtime, but Dumb Luck got the win in both of them. And then Game 7 became extremely one-sided, ending up as a 5-1 win for Dumb Luck. So for the 3rd event in a row, the team that was OCE's favorite was knocked out in the quarterfinals. And as far as comparing expectations to actual results, this is one of the most disappointing splits I've seen from a team in a long time. And now it seems like they'll have some serious work to do if they're going to get back up to the level that they honestly should be. The next series saw Ground Zero get a sweep over Attack of the Invisible Ninja, so no surprises there. And then Pioneers looked like they were going to skate to their own dominant victory after they got a 10-1 win over Merge Esports in Game 1. But they were able to fight back, and they brought that series all the way to a Game 7. But after Hunter scored the game-winning goal with 9 seconds left in that final game, Pioneers went on to win that series. Then both Ground Zero and Pioneers got 4-0 sweeps in their semifinal matchups, which led them to meet up in the grand finals for the 3rd time this split. In his time with Ground Zero, Super Lucky was dominating the matchup against his old team, because Ground Zero and Pioneers faced off against each other 4 times so far this split, and Ground Zero won every single match. So Pioneers had one more chance to turn the tide a little bit and get their own win in the series. But after Ground Zero jumped out to a 3-1 lead heading into Game 5, it seemed like that wasn't going to happen. But then after a close overtime win in Game 5, and then another close win by a score of 1-0 in Game 6, Pioneers brought it back, and we are now going into a Game 7 to determine the winner of this series and the regional. And just like the rest of the series, this final game was also really tight, because heading into the final minute, these two teams were tied at 1 goal apiece. But after Banana had scored with 46 seconds left, the floodgates opened, and Pioneers scored a total of 4 goals in the last minute to win the final game 5-1 and finally get their first win over Ground Zero, while also winning their first regional of the winter. But now heading out of the regionals, both Ground Zero and Pioneers will have their focus on the major, because they're representing a region that hasn't done well internationally in a long time. The last time we saw an OCE team make it to the top 8 of an RLCS LAN was all the way back in the Season 8 World Championship, which is almost 3.5 years ago now. So you can bet that both of these teams are going to do everything in their power to try to end that trend. Alright, with that, we are officially done with all the regionals for the winter split. But we still have a full month until the start of the major, so I'll make sure to get some stuff out there to keep you all entertained in the meantime. But until then, thanks for watching.